Welcome back, Bernardos. We're ready to move on from our discussion of abstract expressionism and color field painting to talk a little bit more about a moment in history where the world goes pop and moves in a different direction. What you get basically in the galleries is an esoteric form of art that is reductive and minimal and all designed on process as being the end all be all. And there seems to become an equal and opposite move in the opposite direction for something that uses visual imagery. And with the rise of consumerism being something that the middle class responds to, this becomes kind of an opportunity for a new form of art that makes use of that contemporary time. Now, there is so much on Andy Warhol that's out there in the world for you to know, full-length documentaries, number of different things about his life that you probably recognize. It's my job as your art history teacher, though, to fill in the gaps and try to create the process by which we get an Andy Warhol. So I want to take you back to the timeline here and show you where we've been and where we're going again. So if you take a look here, basically we've looked at post-war expressionism. We've looked at the rise of the gallery system in APAH. Clement Greenberg, a New York critic who's basically pushing formalism. It's basically going to push toward a minimal design. Now, minimalism here is really a sculptural tradition where you get sculptors totally not using the figure, not using narrative, using basically materials to create new realities in the gallery. What I mean by that is that when you walk into the gallery, it's not uncommon for you to find like a metal sheet on the floor or stacked up cubes that are fastened to the wall, part metal, part plexiglass, and you get the title as Untitled. You don't get very much to go on. So it can be kind of a challenge for someone in the 1950s and 60s to walk into a room and find that art engaging. So it makes sense to me that pop art would be the equal and opposite reaction to that, where art swings back the other way. What you may not know is that there were two brands of pop art, and we get this 1950s version. Later, we'll get the 1960s version, and Warhol fits in that second phase of it. Okay, so let me show you first how this all got started with pop art, starting with Richard Hamilton. Of course, we'll come back to the Marilyn diptych in just a second. But the idea is that you kind of need to know what's going on here in London first. So this piece by Richard Hamilton is called "What Makes Our Homes So Unique and So Interesting." And you can see that it's basically a collage, and it uses a lot of different influences here, some of which are dime store novels, dime store comic books, elevated to the status of high art. Things that look like they're from ad campaigns where you got a lady vacuuming a stair over here, and it says the normal vacuums only reach this far, right? It's very much coming from the world of advertising. Here's Charles Atlas holding a Tootsie Pop, right? And a female from a pinup who looks like she's got a lampshade on her head in front of a sliced package of canned meats. I mean, this is all heavily processed stuff that's being sold and pushed on the European American consumer. And what you're getting is a very different kind of reality that seems to have taken a step forward in the modern world. I mean, our world at this time is looking a lot different than it did in 1945. So Richard Hamilton put this image in a magazine and kind of laid out his mantra for pop art. It's stuff that we recognize. It's stuff that basically influences our everyday lives. If we take a look around us, we'll find the art around us. So it's a very different referential point of view. Let me get rid of my laser pointer here. So the idea then kind of takes off here in the United States. Why don't we appropriate other things that we take for granted, icons like the American flag, and see what we can do with that information to challenge people's notion of what's around them every day? Jasper Johns here takes newspaper clippings about current contemporary events, and he pastes them onto a canvas. He uses encaustic, which we haven't talked about in a long time, basically as a wax-based form of paint and pigment, and spreads it onto the canvas. If you look closely, you can see the newspaper stories are trying to come through the wax, and it's like a cacophony of sound and voices that are basically comprising what we know of America. That layered process continues with this piece, Three Flags, and you see that he's going to play with this icon over and over again and challenge people's associations with something that almost at that time seems sacred. This is the 1950s. This is the era right after World War II. This is the era of the Red Scare, and people are like, is he being patriotic or unpatriotic? Um, you get images of the United States that are abstracted and swathed over with just references of places and sites. And that becomes an icon that we can begin to manipulate. It's almost like taking a physical piece of sculpture and turning it into a flat two-dimensional painting. So you get some interesting associations from Jasper Johns. This piece, you really can see the encaustic. It's the white flag, and it shows you basically stars, a field of stripes with the newspaper print really evidently coming through. It's almost like white noise, right? And you got to remember that color TV is now a thing in the 1950s and 60s. People are watching news and sourcing information in a variety of different ways. It's almost like it's a barrage of different voices, and it's like modern America actually exists in a different world now. Rob Rauschenberg was a friend of Jasper Johns, and basically the two of them riffed off of one another. Jasper Johns was basically working with painting and sculpture, and Rob Rauschenberg here wants to combine the two. These literally are called combine paintings, where you take a three-dimensional piece and make it part of the composition. Some of them on the floor, some of them on the wall. This piece called Bed is a reference to his love affairs with Jasper Johns and several other male counterparts in the 1950s. So he takes a bed, mounts it on a wall, and basically paints these characteristic Ab-X drips and color all over the composition. He does that quite a bit with this work here, Odalisque, which is a riff, of course, on the Le Grand Odalisque. You get a pillar, an icon of consumerism here that's fanciful and almost tongue-in-cheek. These guys basically play a lot around with ideas that started with Dada and surrealism. So there's always this kind of pun in the visual artwork of a Rob Rauschenberg here. We have his work called Canyon. Now, you have an actual eagle sitting on a ledge there with a pillow tied to a bar. It's a reference to the rape of Ganymede, which is a story that goes back to Zeus. Zeus basically takes the shape of an eagle and finds a beautiful young boy to be his servant. He absconds with him, takes him up to Mount Olympus. It's a theme that had been in art since the beginning of time, but not quite this way. In the work, you can see there obviously is a sculptural section, but in the imagery, you see a young child, a boy here, and then references to things like a variety of different social issues of the day. The pillow is a visual pun on the boy's butt cheeks, right? Basically, you can see this is kind of making fun of today, but also trying to say something a little bit more about how we process information. It's a barrage of information from multiple sources, some of them academic, some of them mythological, some of them coming from things like labor, a social revolution that's going on roughly at the same time period. So it's when he steps away from combine paintings, guys, that he begins to kind of use silkscreen. And this work in 1964 was done literally right after the assassination of JFK. His image was everywhere. Basically, this image comes from the moment of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he gets really adamant with the Russians who have just put missiles in Cuba that this will not happen, not be allowed. And you see a barrage of other imagery that basically was also synonymous with the age, the images of the space race. It's kind of like, you've left the TV on too long and it's becoming a buzzy, blurred picture that kind of references the idea we're processing information a little bit differently now than we did before. News media and print and radio are giving away to color TV, and this seems to be kind of a visual representation of that. That silkscreen idea, of course, is going to play well into the body of work of a lot of people, including June Quick to See Smith and Trade, who uses that same encaustic approach of layering newspaper articles about North Native Americans and their experience during this time period. And she references that artwork, or that style in her artwork. So it's also influential to this guy, Andy Warhol, because of the silkscreen process. Andy Warhol's most famous saying was, "I want to be a machine." He wanted to be so reductive as to take the artist out of the process completely and embrace the mass-produced idea as something that was appropriate for the world of art making. You have on the left the Coca-Cola bottles that we recognize from advertising at that time. He liked the consumerism because he knew that whoever bought a Coca-Cola, you could never buy one that was better. A Coke is a Coke is a Coke. And that seemed to be for him something that was democratizing in kind of a mass produced, identity less kind of way. The famous tomato soup cans, the soup cans series that he did. As a young boy, Andy Warhol, not Warhol, basically was sick quite a bit. He had a nervous condition that gave him challenge through the rest of his life. His mother would feed him these simple foods, and he grew to have an affinity for them as something that provided health and sustenance. And he would constantly go to the mass produced labels for inspiration for subject matter for the rest of his life. So lots of these that we could look at. Here you're seeing the Mona Lisa silk screened twice side by side, but they look like very different images. Subtle applications of different amounts of ink make these figures begin to look like different compositions. And the fact that he's stealing the artwork and making something new, that process of appropriation is something that's going to work into his body of work. Here we see film stills of Elvis Presley in a cowboy western, also reproduced. What he's introducing is the concept of something called seriality, where you see a serial set of images that span a time period or a process. You print them over and over and over again, and it seems to pay homage to a particular idea or theme. Here we see in this one Jackie Onassis, or Jackie Kennedy, on the day of the assassination, wearing her iconic pillbox hat and reacting to the news that JFK has just been assassinated, and then images of her on the day of the funeral. So we get this like moment in time that is shared. Remember, these images are coming over the airwaves over and over and over and over again with this national tragedy. And they begin to kind of blur together the way that we process information today. Remember, there's no social media. There's no way to text anyone at this time. We're getting everything from print, radio, and TV. And these images are synonymous with someone kind of going viral at that time. Of course, Marilyn's image was everywhere. Marilyn was actually an actress who was kind of a facade of a person. Her face, her features, it's all part of the Hollywood machine, and I use that word intentionally. Her real name was Norma Jean, as you guys already know. She was a Midwestern female who comes to Hollywood and wants to be famous, and she's successful in becoming like almost the iconic sex goddess of the 1950s, early 1960s film industry. Her persona was plastered everywhere, especially because of what happened to her. And it seems like with Warhol, he's examining whether that symbol becomes kind of an icon for consumerism at its highest, right? A processed Hollywood persona basically replaces all the icons of the past. I think it's important to note, too, here we see his gold Marilyn at the MoMA, that Warhol in his young days was Greek Orthodox. And if you're looking at the golden Marilyn, look at what he would have seen as a young kid. Golden icons on every surface inside this typical Byzantine church. So to replace that image, he puts golden Marilyn, and Marilyn in the middle of a field of gold, very much like the Byzantine icons that you see from an earlier time period. So there's definitely an influence about celebrating contemporary life as something that's almost taking on an otherworldly persona. And that's what leads us to the Marilyn diptych. Now, the title, you got to make note, it's a 2-panel piece. That typically is something that is done for Christian work that's going to be an altar piece or a devotional piece. It's a large work, guys. It's almost floor to ceiling. And so you're absolutely forced to stop and take note of it the way that you might expect to in the midst of an altar inside a church. Of course, we can describe that silk screened image, the process that he used to apply the image to the canvas over and over and over and over again, over and over and over and over again. You see it in color on the left, you see it in black and white on the right. But what you may not realize is that the color on the left was actually painted on over the black and white images, which were silk screened before. and kind of a metaphor for her life, always having to put on makeup, always having to put on a smile, always having to have the hair just so. She puts on that persona and gets made up in her life the way that Andy Warhol makes up and paints her into reality here. So it's really interesting to see. At this time, remember, she's just passed away, apparent suicide, a very sad end to a tragic life, now being celebrated in the media over and over and over again. It seems to be an artwork that questions how long will her memory last as you look at her life and then you look at her death. It seems like the black and white images are beginning to fade out a bit. And how long? One of his famous sayings, everybody has their 15 minutes of fame. I guess Marilyn gets a little bit more than that than the rest of us. But the idea is how long is that memory going to last? It's almost like the persistence of memory is being questioned here as we try to paint history and remember it in a certain kind of way that ultimately is destined to fade over time. So there is the work in the gallery. That's at the Tate in London, I think, the Tate Modern. And it has the effect and the draw of being something that's almost like a secular religious icon. So this piece will be done many different times, many different ways. And you'll see that this is an example of appropriation in art. If you look up on the left, guys, that's a film still, a photograph from a movie campaign that was out right near the end of her life. And it was one that was being, processed by the studio system and pushed out to, movie houses all over the country. They could show this picture and say, look, Marilyn's going to be in a new movie. Come see us, right? So he uses that image as the silkscreen basis for what he will apply in color. Basically, this is an art history term that's very useful for us later. If you see something you recognize as being an image of someone from a photograph, or maybe like the Mona Lisa as a work of art, to use it and create something new is what we call appropriation. So I wanted you to know that story. Marilyn's appropriated image is definitely put through the ringer here. You have to make note, Andy Warhol was working in New York City. He called his studio the factory. And he basically would make a film. He would make these works. It's a very interesting counter subculture going on at the time. This is the era of the 1960s and the Cultural Revolution, we know as the Sexual Revolution. So it's a kind of an experiment in how to bring that kind of art making to the fore. And this is a product of the factory there. So I wanted you to know a little bit more about how we got to Andy Warhol. And that's essentially what we have here when we take a look. You've got basically one of the many images that we know him for. So I'm going to leave it there and get to more of Claes Oldenburg and Yayoi Kusama in just a minute.